I'm Kathleen Dalton, a historian from the Lexington Lyceum Advocates, a nonprofit group trying to reopen the Ellen Stone Building, which is a historic structure in Lexington, Massachusetts, where a whole lot of history happened. And we're trying to tell the story of that history. Ralph Waldo Emerson preached there. We think Henry David Thoreau made a visit. The Alcotts were there. We have anti-slavery advocates in and out of the building. It was a lyceum. It was a source of public education. And there's a very interesting family, the Robbins family, who lived there and were activists. Today we have Dean Grodzins, Theodore Parker's biographer, and he's going to tell us, he's going to help us explain how upset the Robbins family was when kidnappers came to Boston and grabbed people off the street. Now, if this sounds like us looking at the past to explain the present, think of it that way if you want. We'll talk about that at the end. But it's a moment in the past when kidnappers were authorized by the federal government to come to Boston and grab people off the street and drag them back into slavery. So that's a really important historic moment. And for those of us who are working on the Stone Building and getting it reopened as a historic site and as a community center, we really want to know why the Robbins family went to Boston to hear Theodore Parker, their hero, talk about what could we do when the federal government's going crazy doing these horrible things. Can we get some wisdom from the Stone Building folks? So I'm going to start by asking you a hard question. I hope you forgive me, Dean. What place did the Stone Building have in the larger anti-slavery movement?
I think it was a part of a network of sites that people used to give anti-slavery talks, to organize anti-slavery activities. And you needed those in every community because in some communities it was very controversial to be an abolitionist. And some places, particularly in the early years of the abolitionist movement, the 1830s, you could be subject to mob violence for supporting the anti-slavery cause. So needing places where you could meet, needing places where you could have anti-slavery talks, that was important. And the Lyceum movement, because the Stone Building functioned as a lyceum, got started again in the 1830s, about the same time as the abolitionist movement. I could say a little bit more about those things, but that was a movement of sort of public education generally. So most lyceum lectures were not necessarily political. They could deal with any range of subjects. The anti-slavery movement did begin organizing anti-slavery lecture series that focused on that issue and the many sub-issues that came out of the anti-slavery movement, such as slavery in the territories, the fugitive slave issue, et cetera, et cetera. So, so just to put this in context, so since the American Revolution, there had been an anti-slavery movement, a movement opposed to slavery. And even before that, there had been something, particularly among radical Quakers. But most of the protests against slavery, for example, slave revolts, before the 1870s and 1880s, 1770s and 1780s, were protesting being enslaved. That is, nobody wants to be enslaved. You don't have any rights. You don't have any control over your family. But they weren't necessarily revolts against slavery itself, because slavery itself was so ingrained in the way the world worked. It's rather like saying, I am against war. It's a very, you might be a pacifist, but yours is a minority position. The idea that you could actually get rid of war, people have tried at different points. But it seemed as unlikely to get rid of enslavement as to get rid of war. But that began to shift for a whole bunch of reasons, and it's a complicated story. But one critical component was the idea of universal rights, which really begins to take political hold with the American Revolution and then the French Revolution. And so you begin to get, people say the first big slave revolt, which took as its goal the elimination of slavery, was the one in Santo Domingo that became Haiti. So that signals a big shift. And it's in the 1780s that Massachusetts officially ends slavery. And there starts to be an argument about slavery that persists for the rest of American, through the Civil War. So to understand what's going on in Massachusetts when people are grabbing people off the streets, you have to look at this question of what's called the fugitive slave issue. So when the Constitution was written, there were two huge compromises that were made between states that had a large slave population and states where slavery was disappearing or had been abolished. There wasn't yet a North or South the way there got to be later. And the two big ones were that the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved people towards congressional representation and in the Electoral College, and and also towards taxation for taxation purposes, and a rule that forbade the closing of the enslavement and importation of people from Africa for at least 20 years. I mean, they could have continued it. As it happened, they closed it after 20 years, but they could have continued it. They just couldn't do it before then. So those two compromises got a lot of attention during the ratification debates of the Constitution by people who thought it was unjust. And people have been worried about slavery because the word slave does not appear in the U.S. Constitution, and that was deliberate. What's interesting to me, because I went and I looked at the state constitutions, and starting in the 1790s with Kentucky, you start to get, which was a new state, became a new state in 1793, you start to get state constitutions explicitly recognizing slavery. None of the constitutions before that time explicitly recognized slavery and the right to own slaves, even in places where slavery was very important, like South Carolina and Virginia. People felt uncomfortable with it while they're calling for liberty. And so the Constitution reflects that moment. We start to get increasing recognition of slavery going forward, culminating in the Constitution of the so-called Confederate States of America, which includes the right to own slaves in its Bill of Rights. But if you go, another question that came up was, what happens if somebody who is enslaved under the laws of one state goes to another state? What should happen to that person? And the term used in the Constitution is owes service and labor. And according to the Constitution, that person should be delivered up and returned to the original state. Now, what's interesting is that this clause got almost no attention, as far as I can tell, during the ratification debates. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is as I mentioned, slavery was everywhere in America at that time. There were a lot of enslaved people in New York. There were a lot of enslaved people in New Jersey. And even places like Pennsylvania, which had already had a gradual emancipation law put in place, there were still a lot of people being legally held as slaves because gradual emancipation can be very gradual. The most extreme case being New Jersey. So 1803, New Jersey launches gradual emancipation, and there still are like 15 people enslaved in 1860 in New Jersey.
Wow, that is gradual.
So slavery is all around in the North. So it didn't have an obvious sectional issue. People, if somebody had escaped from Connecticut to New York, or New York to Connecticut, or New York to Massachusetts, that was still as much an issue as running from, say, Maryland to Pennsylvania. So the second reason I think it didn't create any controversy at first is that if you look where the Fugitive Slave Clause is in the Constitution, and this plays a role in the resistance to the laws that came later, it's in Article 4. Now, if you remember your Constitution, Article 4 talks about what the states owe to each other. It's not about the powers of Congress. It's about what the states owe to each other. So the states are supposed to honor full faith and credit of each other. If you owe a debt in one state, it's not negated if you move to another. So this falls in that category. So it implies that if somebody is to be delivered up, it's to be delivered up in the state, under the laws of the states in which that person is found. So, for example, if that person is entitled to a jury trial, they get a jury trial. It was not a federal matter at all. And so a lot of people from that point on said that any law passed by the federal government on this matter, they refused to regard it as constitutional because they said it's entirely a state matter. But the federal government very quickly got involved because of a dispute that grew up between Pennsylvania and Maryland over somebody claimed in Maryland who insisted they were free in Pennsylvania. And so Congress enacted a law in 1793, it was called the Fugitive Slave Law, which tried to create some sort of federal procedure to resolve these disputes. And it meant that somebody who wanted to claim someone an enslaver who wanted to claim an enslaved person had to go to some official and get a document. It could be just the justice of the peace, but they had to get a document. And that would entitle them to bring that person out of the state and back. A lot of people were bothered by this because it didn't seem to give nearly enough legal protections to the person who was the alleged enslaved person. And especially because it was not uncommon for free black people to be kidnapped and sold into slavery, even if they were legally free. Those who remember the movie 12 Years a Slave know that story. That's the most famous story, but there were a lot of examples. It happened to black seamen. It happened to there's even a whole book of what the author calls the reverse Underground Railroad in Philadelphia. So, how do you protect the issue of how to protect the rights of free black people begins to perk up at that time. And the law of 1793 never is successfully enforced in Massachusetts because it's unpopular. And a lot of people don't think it's constitutional. Well, then a big dispute happens in 1842 because there's a guy goes from Maryland to Pennsylvania and grabs a woman from Pennsylvania, can't get a certificate because Pennsylvania had passed a law saying that there had to be a jury trial to prove that this person was enslaved. In fact, it was pretty dubious that this person was in fact enslaved. This woman was enslaved. And so, but the guy said, I'm not going to ignore it, and he just brought the woman back to Maryland, where she did end up in slavery. And so the case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in a decision written by the Massachusetts Justice, Joseph Story, said that laws like that of Pennsylvania were unconstitutional because the fugitive slave issue was entirely a federal matter. So it was a big shift from what it seemed to be in 1787. And the reason I think they made this move, and I'm not the only one who thinks this, is that the issue of slavery had by this point become very controversial. And that's partly because of the growing abolitionist movement. So there had been an anti-slavery movement that had emerged since the time of the Revolution, as I said earlier. But a whole series of events in the 1820s led to a radicalization of this movement, and a new movement called the abolitionist movement got started in the early 1830s, which called for the immediate emancipation of slaves in the South, and then their admission into full citizenship afterwards. The second part was very important because there was also a big movement saying, well, we will emancipate enslaved people as long as we can send them back to Africa.
The colonization
society.
Right.
And colonization had a lot of supporters, including, at least officially, Abraham Lincoln well into the Civil War. I mean, he was still talking about colonization even as he was talking about emancipation. He didn't fully give up the colonization idea until he issued the final Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st, 1863. So colonization remained a popular idea. But the abolitionists rejected it. They said this is a false claim and it's destructive of the rights of free black people, and there has to be equal rights. These were very radical ideas.
So our folks in the Stone Building are Garrisonians. So
right, they're Garrisonian. So the leading white abolitionist, the most famous white abolitionist, was William Lloyd Garrison, who created a newspaper called The Liberator. It never had a wide circulation, but it had a lot of influence.
People were reading it in Lexington and Concord, for
right.
sure. And I should add that this book, I'm sure you know, argues that the anti-slavery movement had a really strong black base. And that's really important to remember, but it was much more dangerous for black people to step out into political space than for white people, because they could be kidnapped or captured, or the police were not treating them very well even then.
The molten core of the abolitionist movement was always the free black population. That's where like everything radiated from. Persistent activism, persistent passion on the issue, and obviously so, because enslavement for a free person essentially negates your personhood. You're no longer a human being at that point. And so it's an existential question. So for the free black people of the North, enslavement was an existential question. And it affected everything in their lives, even if they were free. And so the idea that it was an intolerable situation persisted. And then increasingly, for many reasons, you began to get white allies who had more political flexibility, who could take it into a wider space. So
Stone Building.
The Stone Building, right. So Garrison was one of those. And in fact, his newspaper, The Liberator, could not have initially been published without black support. He got a lot of black support from subscribers and so forth. And he deliberately worked with black allies. And the anti-slavery movement from the beginning, when it organized, when these formal anti-slavery societies and abolitionist societies were founded, they were always interracial. But, and this becomes important to the story later, there were certain issues that created conflicts among white abolitionists that were not issues among black abolitionists. And one was, how far do you obey the laws? So there were a lot of people who said, and particularly for the issue of fugitive slaves, who were looking for a legal way to prevent the return of fugitive slaves. And they wanted to still uphold the Constitution and uphold the laws. But then there were plenty who said, no, it doesn't matter whether it's legal or not. This is unjust, or they would often say against the law of God, and we've got to oppose it. This was not really an issue in the black community because I said it's an existential question there. There was a broad agreement that whatever it took to get you out of slavery, we would support.
And blacks really ran the Underground Railroad.
Well, right. So the Underground Railroad, as it came to be called around 1840, was an informal network of people who could help somebody who had managed to escape get to either settle anonymously in the North or get to a place which no longer recognized slavery, particularly Canada. Canada had abolished slavery, as part of the British abolition of slavery in the 1830s. I should say Mexico had also abolished slavery, so there was a much less studied, although now getting somewhat studied, movement into Mexico. But the focus of much of the attention was on the movement to Canada. So initially, it was mostly black communities in the North that did this. They had very little money, but if somebody showed up at your door and you were a black person and this person you gathered, this person was running away, you'd often offer them food and shelter, and perhaps if you had it, some money to help them along their way. Perhaps you could even take them places. Two things made this and there would also occasionally be white people, usually Quakers, because some Quakers had very strong anti-slavery feelings, which grew out of the early Quaker movement. Some white Quakers. So this movement got much more organized when the abolitionist movement got going, because suddenly you had these anti-slavery societies and they began organizing in all there was still a very small number of people. It was a very small minority of people, and they were very politically unpopular. They were seen as radicals. They were seen as people out to destroy the Constitution.
They mobs broke Frederick Douglass's wrist. They killed Elijah Lovejoy. Right. They mobbed William Lloyd Garrison. Right. Wendell Phillips was almost killed. Yeah, black allies had to save some of the Garrisonians in Boston.
Right, and the very often anti-abolitionist riots become anti-black riots, and the black communities would be attacked. So this idea of being mobbed by people who saw the abolitionists as dangerous radicals.
Gentlemen of property and standing.
That's what that was the accusation, that it was gentlemen of property and standing, people the prominent people, very often prominent politically, very often with economic ties to the South, who, for example, a cotton factor or something, somebody who bought cotton in the South and sold it to factories in the North to make cloth. They made a lot of money off of slavery, and they would therefore be opposed to the anti-slavery movement. So these people often directed these mobs, and as a result, no one was ever prosecuted for these mobs. Just like later on, almost no one would be prosecuted for lynch mobs. And these were sort of like lynch mobs. So it was politically very dangerous to be anti-slavery. But these organizations would be organized in town to town, very often among women, whose many white women saw a distinct connection between their position and enslavement, because for a long time, and this only began to change in the mid-19th century, if a woman got married, she also in many ways ceased to legally exist as a person. Not completely, she was still a citizen, but couldn't own property in her own right. Any money she owned was owned by her husband. Her children were officially her husband. So if they got divorced, they would go to him.
She could be beaten quite a bit.
Yeah, she was legally allowed to be beaten, etc. So there were a lot of parallels between the condition of, say, a legal condition of a married woman and the condition of an enslaved person, even though in practical terms, the enslaved person had a much worse condition and also even less control over their own family than a white woman who was married. And so the women's rights movement and the anti-slavery movement emerged kind of together in the United States.
In the Stone Building, the women were part of the great silent army of abolitionism.
Right.
Hannah Robbins, the wife of the founder, belonged to the Middlesex County Anti-Slavery Society and went to meetings with men, white and black men, and figured out the tactics. And she knew Mary Merrick Brooks, the firebrand who finally converted Emerson to abolitionism. And so she was probably the women of the Stone Building were more radical than the men.
Well, that was many people have said that there was a lot of very prominent radical women in the anti-slavery movement, and it begins with sort of petitioning campaigns. So the anti-slavery movement begins organizing these petitioning campaigns to petition state legislatures, to petition Congress to take stronger anti-slavery stands. For example, there had gotten to be a widespread consensus by the 19th century that Congress had no authority to abolish slavery in the states. So if a state had if slavery was recognized under state law, Congress could not abolish it. It was a state matter. Now that I could say more about that because there's an increasing movement to make slavery national that the radical pro-slavery people began pushing by the 1840s and 1850s, which is one reason you get the Civil War. But the idea that Congress couldn't do that, but they could do a bunch of things, including abolish slavery in the District of Columbia.
Which they did in the Compromise of 1850.
They didn't abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. What they did was they abolished the slave trade.
Okay.
Slavery was only abolished in the District of Columbia in 1862 during the Civil War. And interestingly enough, that was a gradual emancipation law. So
very tame.
Very tame. But it was considered, was considered way too radical. And the threat of possible anti-slavery action in the District of Columbia is one reason that the District of Columbia is the shape it is today. Because if the District of Columbia is made up of grants of land from Maryland and Virginia. And so it used to have a Maryland side of the river, of the Potomac River, but there was also a Virginia side to the Potomac River, which was part of the District of Columbia. Well, as the anti-slavery movement starts to gain ground, Virginia said, actually, we'll take our land back. And they did. So that's why the District of Columbia is only on one side of the river and not the other. Oh. But so so they would, these petition campaigns were for things like, let's abolish slavery in the District of Columbia.
And our stone building people were big petition people,
right.
too.
And so women would often did their first major political action, which was they couldn't vote at this time, right? So they would be essentially canvassing. They would want other women to sign these petitions. When men would do petitions, what they do is they'd go to like the local tavern and maybe tack it up on the wall, and everyone could sign it. You couldn't reach women that way. You had to go to their homes. So women would go home to home, and what we would today know as canvassing, they kind of invented it, and would go and knock on doors, and then they'd have a conversation, and then they'd persuade people to sign, women to sign, and maybe get the whole family to sign. And this was a political education for a whole lot of women, and if you look at a lot of the people who become leaders of the women's rights movement later in the century, the push for women's suffrage, it starts with women who went door to door in these canvassing campaigns. There are the same people. That is, you look at their early history of these leaders. That's what they were doing when they were young women. So what happens is that as the anti-slavery movement emerges, the abolitionist movement, and it starts to gain traction all across the North. In the South, there's growing anger over this, and the anti-slavery movement is effectively outlawed in the South. And there's lots of laws that are passed that basically says you're not allowed to talk about, or you'll go to jail, or you might even be executed. There were even some death penalty laws in the South because you were inciting slaves to insurrection. So that was the argument. It's an interesting moment that the Southern leaders demanded that the North pass similar laws to ban anti-slavery speech. And a number of states, including Massachusetts, debated it and then rejected it.
Charles Follen and Samuel May stood up. Some of our people associated with the stone building went to the Massachusetts legislature and said, we believe in free speech. You cannot take that from us. And
they had a lot of support on that issue. So what the North tried to do was people who didn't like the anti-slavery movement, but they still wanted free speech, at least legal free speech. So they tried to work around it by essentially extra legal action. That's where the mobs came from. But they never actually formally outlawed the anti-slavery movement. And eventually, more and more people in the North, white folks, began to identify the slavery issue with their own rights, the rights of freedom of speech, the rights of petition. So all these petitions were going to Congress, and Congress said, well, these are too divisive, and therefore they passed a law forbidding them to be admitted. They passed a rule, I should say.
The gag rule.
The gag rule, right. Forbidding them from being admitted. And famously, the congressman from Massachusetts, the former U.S. president, and John Quincy Adams, who had a special status because he was the son of one of the founders of the U.S., and he made it his mission to protect the right of petition by presenting all these anti-slavery petitions to Congress, even when he was not supposed to be allowed to do so. A friend of mine, Joanne Freeman, has written a book about dueling, and one of the things that a lot of anti-slavery people had to deal with was that they would be challenged to duels for making anti-slavery statements in Congress. But it was considered inappropriate to challenge John Quincy Adams to a duel because he was elderly, he was a former U.S. president, and he was the son of a founder. And so they just would rage at him, and they would say, if you weren't who you were, I would do the, and he just delighted in that. But that's a separate story.
But that's the 1840s.
That's the 1840s.
But it gets much meaner in
It
the
does.
18th.